We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. According to the most recent polls, if the presidential election was to take place tomorrow, Joe Biden will lose to Donald Trump. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an author, he's a political activist, and he's the co-host of the Freedom Side Live, a live video show every Thursday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Breakthrough News. Eugene Puryear, welcome back.
Brian, as always, thank you so much for having me here on the show.
These are remarkable polls, Eugene. 5 of the 6 swing states that Joe Biden absolutely needs to win, he's losing. And when you think about the remarkable turn of events, if I was going to talk to you on January 7th, 2021, for instance, not so long ago, after the attempt to decertify the election using a massive turnout of Trump supporters, a move that was defeated, that brought shame and ridicule on Donald Trump's head. It would be hard to have anticipated that he could become president once again. But here we are. Donald Trump is beating Joe Biden. Anyway, I want to get first, before we talk about what this means, what it might mean, will it make any difference? These are important questions. I think people on the left are debating this right now. We want to debate it. But before we get into the debate, the controversy about whether or not this actually matters, or why it matters, or how it matters, I want to get your take. When you step back and look at the last 4 years, a remarkable turn of events.
It really is a remarkable turn of events, and I think it speaks to the extreme unrest that exists in the American political system, or maybe the better way to put it is the extreme unhappiness of people in the United States with the state of the political system. I mean, the most recent New York Times poll, and I'll come back to some of the polling that a lot of people are talking about that is laying out various different things about what is happening in the horse race, also had, even though they buried this deep in the article, I think it's more important than the horse race at this stage, quite frankly, but found that roughly 70% of people, I believe it was actually 69% of people, said that they felt the economy either need major changes or to be completely torn down. So 70% of people, a supermajority of people, think that the economy needs major changes or to be completely torn down. Amongst those 18 to 29, that number was 78%. Amongst the black voters who were polled, that number was 78%. Amongst those who the New York Times would consider to be quote-unquote working class, I have some quibbles about how this is parsed out, but that is those without a college degree. 73% thought the economy needed major changes or to be completely torn down. And just to give you some context on that overall issue that's there, I mean, we're living in a country where 21% of the labor force, according to the Census Household Pulse survey, 21% of the labor force, so a fifth of people in the country who are working, are finding it very difficult, that's quote unquote, very difficult to make ends meet week to week. And just to expand that number a little bit more, 85% of all people working in the United States are finding it at least a little bit difficult to make it week to week. So of the 160 million odd people who have a job in the United States of America, the vast majority of them are having at least a little trouble, and about a fifth of them are finding it very difficult to be able to survive here in the United States when the Biden administration is saying the economy is good. You have obviously the ongoing war in Gaza. You have various different forms of anger and unrest on a range of different issues. But I think that's speaks to why Donald Trump has been able to maintain his credibility, why he's been able to make a comeback, because there is no real alternative to the political status quo, including Donald Trump. But the nature of his sort of chaos agent way of presenting himself, the fact that he's taking a sort of radical right-wing version of the status quo, like in the core, a lot of it won't change in terms of the fundamentals, but it has a lot of sort of radical right-wing elements that make it appear to be something different than the status quo, I think allows allows him to be able to ride on this anti-establishment sentiment. But I think whether it's the continued rise of Donald Trump, whether it's the mass protests on the street, whether it's the strike waves that are sweeping the country, whether it's the general unrest that's being seen in the polls, we can see that the real sort of root cause of all of this is U.S. capitalism is in a state of disarray. It is in an inflection point mentality. It's at a time where people can see that the actual, situation is dire for humanity in and of itself, especially when we consider climate change. And because there's no real solutions, it's continuing to drive political turmoil. And people like Donald Trump are able to take advantage of that.
No, I think that's important, Eugene. There's a lot of factors, sort of subterranean factors, not subterranean, but sort of parallel streams here that are driving this opposition to Biden. Of course, we have the Palestine movement, the movement that's outraged by the genocide that Biden is supporting. He's just sending, by the way, another $1 billion in weapons after he put a, quote, pause on sending 1,800 2,000-pound bombs because he said those bombs would be hurting civilians, like that was a news flash. But no, now a week later, he's sending another $1 billion of arms to Israel in the middle of the genocide. So a lot of people who are in that movement are saying, abandon Biden. We're not going to vote for somebody who is promoting genocide. We might not like Donald Trump, but this is too much. We're not going to support Genocide Joe. So that's one factor. And then the other factor that you pointed out, it's not just one, but multiple factors, but the lives of working class people and poor people and big parts of people who might consider themselves even middle class. They're not happy. Their situation is deteriorating. So that's another element. You have the inadequacy, I would say, to put it mildly, of the U.S. electoral system such that only the two ruling class parties get any mainstream media attention. So people think, if you're sort of just getting your news from the mainstream media, that your only option for Biden would be Trump. You might not be hearing that much about Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia. You might not be hearing about Jill Stein or Cornel West. This is the way the capitalist media presents it. These are the two options. This is the so-called variety that exists in American capitalism. But there is no doubt at this point that whatever the different factor or factors are, it's happening. Joe Biden is losing right now. I want to play two quick clips. So just to convince people that it's not just you and I talking, this is the real surveys. One clip is from Fox News, and then the other is from CNN. So a pro-Trump channel and a pro-Biden channel. Let's listen.
News that we're following for you. New polling shows some bad news for the Biden campaign. Donald Trump leads the presidential race in several key swing states.
And President Biden's support among younger Black and Hispanic voters, that seems to be lagging.
All right, so Eugene, that was Fox News. Here's CNN.
Look, these Sunbelt battleground states, frankly, for the Joe Biden campaign, these numbers are an absolute disaster. The smallest lead is in Arizona for Donald Trump. He's up 6. Look at this, 9 in Georgia, 13 in Nevada. My goodness gracious, my God. That is a huge lead. No Democrat has lost that state since John Kerry lost it back in 2004.
When you look at those numbers, Nevada, Georgia, these are big margins. This isn't even like a squeaker.
No, I think that's a very good point. And to, even give you an example, speaking to the point you made about Gaza, in Michigan, which of course is one of the key states, large Arab American population there, where people are talking about the impact of this, you had about 101,000 people vote uncommitted in the primary there, the Democratic Party primary, indicating that they are unhappy with President Biden over that issue. Now, if you look at the polling that's been coming out, I looked at the Real Clear Politics average of polls for Michigan, right? So that's averaging up all the different polls. And Trump is ahead by about 0.8%, right? So it's pretty close. That's about, if you look at the number of people who voted in 2020 in Michigan in the general, 43,000 people. So again, as I said, 101,000 people voted uncommitted. So you can see in states like right there that even inside of the Democratic base, Biden is working with a very, very thin margin, and potentially, it could be fatal for him to lose voters on this issue. But I think the point you're making about Nevada, the point you're making about Georgia, and one thing that we noticed in the New York Times poll that came out is they polled both registered voters and likely voters, and you saw in some of those states really the needle didn't move that much. Now in some, like Wisconsin, it did, but some of these states like with Nevada and Georgia, and these are states that Biden won in 2020. So he's way, way behind with registered voters, with likely voters. I mean, it really is a warning sign, I would assume, for the Democratic Party. I don't know what they're talking about. I would assume they're sort of panicking here. But it does seem that Trump, at least at this stage in the election, has a very significant lead in the polls, and it's very consistent. And that's why I say looking at polling averages is important, because you average up all the polls. And in fact, according to the RCP average, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, Trump is behind. So Biden is behind. So averaging up all the polls that have actually been done on all the battleground states, whatever the exact margin is of each individual poll, it all averages out to Biden being significantly behind. And I think it speaks to the fact that Biden has no real ability to motivate the people he needs to motivate to get out and vote. I mean, he came in 2020. Now, of course, he did say, nothing will fundamentally change and all of that. But he came out with a big agenda, Build Back Better, which was sort of a big tent, rah-rah kind of agenda that all Democrats could get behind, a lot of Republicans could get behind. It wasn't any new programs, but it was putting a lot of money behind existing programs that are relatively popular, from Medicare to housing to so on and so forth. So again, nothing fundamentally changing, but a boost to the programs that are generally popular, that people feel like help their lives, make it easier for them to survive. And because of the Democrats, the bill was sunk. I mean, obviously Republicans were against it, but because of Senator Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, the bill was sunk. So if you're Biden and he's, again, promising big things, he put out a budget, all these other things, who's really going to believe you when you weren't able to, even when you had the majority in the House, the majority in the Senate, and the White House to push forward your agenda that people were generally in favor of? Why would I believe you now that you're going to do this? Obviously, they're trying to hang their hat on the issue of abortion. Well, Biden was one of the main people in the Senate for years preventing the codification of a woman's right to choose into law. So why would you believe that he's guaranteed to do these things? So even though I think that Biden in many ways is trying to appeal to those he needs to vote, his credibility gap here is significant because the Democrats as a whole were totally unable to deliver in the first 2 years of his presidency when they had all the levers of power to be able to deliver for working class people. They did not do so. And I think when you look at the context of what's happening coming out of the White House now, where they're telling people, oh, the economy is great, everything we did is so fine, don't worry about anything whatsoever, we're so good, Trump is so bad. And then you see stats like what I gave you, that 85% of people working in the United States are having at least a little trouble making ends meet week to week. That a fifth of the workers in the country are having an extreme amount of difficulty in making ends meet week to week. It's like you have this credibility gap in terms of what Biden accomplished, and then you also have this perception gap in terms of what Biden says is happening in the country and what working class people feel is happening in the country. And I think ultimately, thus, he's unable to motivate a significant number of people. I mean, he obviously has a core base of people, core base of Democrats, but he's really leaking support amongst young people, amongst the black population, and amongst lower income voters, which is not talked about as much. But Democrats tend to win lower income voters. But I think this discourse around the economy is also hurting Biden, in that sector as well, because it doesn't correspond to what people's lives are like. So this is a big sign that Biden cannot win the confidence of the country. It's a sign that Trump is doing better, but I don't think Trump is really winning the confidence of the country. I just think he has a more stable coalition of people who are already supporting him. So he's able to sort of just proxy or just by happenstance, essentially by being the other major candidate, be ahead of Biden in terms of these polls. But, let's see what happens on a number of different fronts. The point you made about third parties and other candidates that are out there could become a bigger factor, could become a lesser factor as time goes on. And I think we'll talk about that and how people perceive the difference between the two candidates, but could end up being a bigger factor, especially because we have no idea what's going to happen in the next few months. Who expected October 7th? Who expected, the UAW to win in Tennessee? I mean, all these things are happening that who knows how they'll also shift the political landscape.
True enough. True enough. We don't have a crystal ball. We can actually safely predict that surprising things will happen because so many surprising things have been happening, as you mentioned. Let's go back again for our audience just to review. When Biden came in, he had control, as you said, of the House and the Senate and the White House, meaning presumably that they could pass any laws that they wanted to. During that time period, women lost the right to control their own bodies. It was during Biden that Roe v. Wade was overturned. Now, somebody might say, well, that was the Supreme Court. But the Democrats, having control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, could have passed a bill that said it's not really up to the courts. We're going to make it a law, the law of the land, that abortion rights are an absolute right. Right? They could have done that. They did not do that. There was measures adopted during the Trump administration because of COVID, when 60 million people lost their jobs, to ameliorate the pain and suffering of working class families in America. So, for instance, families were able to get additional funds for family members. There was a moratorium on evictions so that people who couldn't pay their rent because they had been laid off because of COVID, there was a moratorium on evictions. It was during the Biden administration that these COVID relief measures were rescinded, so that the parents who were getting $300 a month per child, a measure that made childhood poverty diminish by 50%. That was taken away, and poverty of children went way up. So you have Roe v. Wade, women lose abortion. You have the return of massive amounts of childhood poverty, which is clearly a policy choice. Millions of Americans risking eviction. So this happened under Biden. So as you said, he can talk against Trump and say this is an election around which the question of whether this is a democratic country or not, you can put out that kind of rhetoric. But for most people, they're not thinking like that because they actually don't believe Joe Biden about anything. Just on the foreign policy issue, Eugene, before I give it back to you, Trump trashed Obama's policy on Cuba. Obama was starting the normalization of relations with Cuba. Trump came in and put 243 new sanctions, coercive measures on Cuba, and Biden didn't lift them. Those measures against Cuba exist. So Biden continued Trump's policy, not Obama's policy.
No,
Basically,
I think that's a very
the same
good
with Venezuela. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Similar in Iran as well. Really it was a continuation of the Trump policies, the Abraham Accords. Of course, well before October 7th, we know that Biden was promoting that. And again, Biden is the leader of the party. So if in the 2 years they had, the Democrats couldn't do the things that the Democratic-based voters wanted them to do, Biden is to blame. And Obama was a similar situation when they had control over the first 2 years. And then you have the Republicans come in, take advantage, win the midterms because people stay home because they're demoralized and, they're able to rise up. And then you have a situation where both Obama and Biden, similar sort of arc, then become complicit in these so-called, deals, these so-called bipartisan deals, which are basically austerity budgets, and they're just a race to how much you are going to cut from programs that actually help people, except for the things that don't help people, like the military, which they continue to push forward. Over the next 6 years, I believe it is, the U.S. will spend about $10.5 trillion on the military and about $6.4 trillion on everything else. So that continues to grow no matter what. In fact, this Congress is frequently voting more money to the Pentagon than what the Pentagon even asked for. But what you have is this Democratic piece where they make a lot of promises, they get in, and then their own members sabotage the ability to move forward because there's no leadership. Biden can't lead, can't bring his party together to pass these things. Republicans then win the midterm elections. Things become much more conservative. Programs start getting cut, and you have the same thing over and over and over again. So the Democratic Party is not a pro-working class party. It's a capitalist party. Many of the members of the Democratic Party have an agenda that's not that different from a lot of members of the Republican Party because they're funded by the same people. And that agenda is to have no increase whatsoever in the social wage for people in the United States. Why? Because they then have to pay more taxes. And people can say, that's overly simplistic, but all you have to look is why Joe Manchin and why some of these other people were saying we can't pass Build Back Better. They said it's going to add to the deficit and we can't raise taxes. So, the whole deficit thing is a whole separate conversation, but they were openly saying they didn't want any policies that were going to increase taxes significantly, even on the ultra wealthy, because, whatever little excuses they were given. So we can see here that the big billionaires who fund and control the politicians who are just their puppets have a united agenda, center left and center right, which is to make sure that there is no significant increase in the social wage, i.e. programs that actually help working class people, which means that they would have to actually give more money of their over to taxes taxes. They're jealously guarding their own hoards. They're like Scrooge McDuck swimming in the gold coins in his vault there in the cartoon. If people who are my age, maybe 38, can remember the old DuckTales after school cartoon. I mean, it really is almost feudal-like when you think about the mentality of these certain individuals. And then you have those who are supporting Trump, who that's not even enough for them. They want to go even further in destroying any protections for working class people so that they can keep even more money. And as Trump has already promised them, to reduce their taxes even more. So this is really a result of the basic structure of the U.S. political system, that you have these two pro-capitalist parties that oscillate between each other, and some of them speak to the problems that exist in the country, but they can't propose, not just that they will not, they can't propose solutions that meet the scale of the problem, because that then collides with the imperatives of capitalism to have profit above all, no matter who it hurts on and throughout the whole process.
As we continue our discussion, Eugene, I want to talk about some of the debates and controversies within the U.S. left about whether or not to support Biden. It's not a new debate. Important political organizations, including some Marxist organizations or organizations that identify as Marxist, say, well, we're going to hold our nose. We know Biden is bad, but we can't allow Trump because that means fascism will come to America. You know, that's the end of democracy. We have to be realistic and pragmatic, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to talk about those debates, but I don't want to do that right this moment. First, I want to talk about how Biden, as a political leader, is insulting the intelligence of young people and insulting the intelligence of all working class voters in the way he presents the issue. And because it's so obvious, people despise him for it. It's not just simply that he can't talk or he's inarticulate or he's too old. The content is bad. I want to play two clips. First, it's about how Biden is describing the young people who have made such a difference in building solidarity with the Palestinian people and against genocide. I want to hear this clip. It's Biden talking about the students and the young people as if they're the purveyors of violence in America when their student encampments have been beaten up, they've been tear gassed, they've been pepper sprayed, they've been arrested. But here's Biden's presentation, and then when you hear it and you think like, oh, why don't young people like Biden? Well, because they're actually listening to Biden. Let's play this clip.
Vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campuses, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduations. None of this is a peaceful protest.
All right, so Eugene, he's caricaturing the students. He's caricaturing the young people. They aren't the purveyors of violence. Again, when you think about the way this new mass movement on Palestine has crystallized, and it's really shaking things up all over the country, these young people are not simply activists. They're intelligent. They have family members. They have siblings, especially other young people who might be voting. This is an insult to their intelligence, and it's an insult about them.
I think that's 100% true. And I mean, we've seen this echoed by others, Hillary Clinton, of course, and, various Biden surrogates. I mean, the idea that, Biden just sort of fueling into this idea, this disgusting idea that the campus protests are somewhat akin to Nazi Germany by backing up this whole thing about them being anti-Semitic, this idea that students don't know what they're talking about. I mean, it's totally belied by the actual media that is coming out from these encampments. And I think I can speak to that pretty well because on Breakthrough News, we've covered many of these encampments. And I would encourage people after they watch this show to check out some of the things we've done here on YouTube where this is currently airing, because what you will see is that the students are very intelligent, know very much what's going on, have a very important critique of what's happening. And again, as you say, I mean, they can see that Biden is just totally and completely, lying about what's going on. And they can remember things like after the so-called beheaded baby story had been completely debunked, that Biden was still going on TV saying that babies were beheaded. So people can also remember, students and others, the history of how Biden has not only just carried water for Netanyahu, but actually repeated continually, outright and completely debunked lies about what was going on as it concerns the genocide in Gaza. And so the idea that, they think that people would just be I don't even know what they're expecting, to be honest with you, in terms of some of this rhetoric and what they think the impact is going to be. But I think it really speaks to, where we are in the country, that they would assume somehow this wouldn't be considered demeaning to students and to others who are watching this and others who are in solidarity with what's happening with the encampment protests. It just makes a mockery of what's going forward. And it makes a mockery of the history in this country of civil disobedience, of the civil rights movement. That's a whole other show in and of itself. But I mean, this entire sort of blinkered attitude about the idea of like, well, you have the right to free speech, but it can't be disruptive. Well, I mean, listen, the march from Selma to Montgomery that he had his vice president down there celebrating was extremely disruptive. Sitting at the lunch counters, extremely disruptive. The freedom rides, extremely disruptive. The uprisings in Harlem in 1964 and Detroit in 1967. The 125 cities burned down after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. Extremely disruptive. But remember, after those uprisings in 1968, what did they do? They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, was about integrating housing. It was completely stalled. No protests, no anything had shaken it loose, but the black people and their allies in this country rose up after King was brutally assassinated, and overnight they passed the bill to push forward. So the civil rights victories that we have, it's critically important we remember that element. The self-defense element. I mean, Charlie Cobb, one of SNCC's great field secretaries, has even written a book about it. That nonviolent stuff will get you killed, about the deep history of self-defense that was going on, of people directly battling the Klan to protect civil rights workers as they did their nonviolent work to make sure they wouldn't be pogromed out by these Klan-type forces who were getting no pushback at all from the FBI, even though they had totally infiltrated the Klan and knew everything they were doing. They allowed them to carry this out. Viola Liuzzo, who was gunned down on the side of the road after Selma in 1965, a mother of multiple children, I believe 5 children, who drove her station wagon from Michigan to Alabama to be a part of the civil rights movement. She was shot with a shotgun by a Klan member. One of the people in the car was an FBI informant. So ultimately, when we look at the history of this, Joe Biden, who ultimately was proud to say he never demonstrated, that he was never part of the civil rights movement, that he was never part of the anti-Vietnam War movement, to create this whole issue of these students are so out of control and free speech is only when you're not disruptive, it makes a mockery of the completely righteous and completely just and very disruptive protests, uprisings, boycotts, and other things that black people in this country had to do in order to find a way to get our own rights, and that young people took on at the end of the 1960s to end the genocidal war in Vietnam, that these people lionize all the time in Black History Month and all these other things. It's a joke, and it's disgusting, and it shows that Biden and every single one of these politicians, sadly many of them black, who are talking about this in the Congress and others, have no idea what happened in the 1960s, have no idea what happened in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and are peddling a complete falsehood of lies to smear these students who are absolutely in the tradition of the anti-apartheid movement, which had encampments in shantytowns and universities all across this country, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and of course the students that went to the civil rights movement. And I would add the students of the 1930s that stood up against fascism in defending Spain.
Excellent points. All of these politicians, Biden, Kamala Harris, every year they, on Martin Luther King's birthday, they get out there and they tell people, let's remember how great Martin Luther King Jr. was. And don't forget he was a pacifist. And don't forget he was an adherent to nonviolence. But he made a big change. Well, Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, one of his children, said that this sort of whitewashing of what actually happened with Dr. King needs to be criticized openly. She said when her father was killed, he was the most hated man in America. She's right about that, or certainly one of them. I mean, you had the demonization of Martin Luther King Jr., which was so complete. And again, it was only the movement in the 1980s where Black America and its allies marched together, stood together, protested together, demanded that there be a national holiday for Dr. King, that it was actually passed. And it happened, by the way, during the administration of Ronald Reagan, who was a right-wing, anti-communist racist. But it was because of the movement of people in the 1980s that we have a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. birthday celebration every year. But he was the most hated man in America in 1968, on April 4th, 1968, when he was assassinated. And the year before that, exactly 1 year before, at Riverside Church, Dr. King made his famous speech condemning the U.S. war in Vietnam, and he was disinvited from ministers' associations meetings all over the country. Dr. King was a heroic figure. He stood up. He was a disruptor, as you pointed out. If Dr. King was alive today, these same politicians would be talking about him the way they're talking about those student protesters, the way Biden is talking about those student protesters. And that's the reality. That's something we always have to remember. That change came about, including the Civil Rights Act, not because Lyndon Johnson gave a gift to Black America, or the later affirmative action programs that were adopted during the Nixon administration, not because Richard Nixon wanted to help Black people. It was because of the almost revolutionary character of what was going on in America. Go ahead.
No, I think that's an important point. And, also in 1967, we had Dr. King tell the New York Times that what he wanted to engage in could basically be called a form of class struggle, that he wanted to see democratic socialism established in the United States of America, obviously launching the Poor People's Campaign, promoting the rights of unionists in Memphis and also in many other places around the country, very strong trade union supporter of Dr. King. I mean, in many ways, the whole reason they had to kill Dr. King is because this transformative vision, which, I think would have been something many people in the country would have embraced, was extremely challenging to the political elites in this country. The same thing with the assassination of Malcolm X. I mean, it's not really possible to look at the history of the United States and think had Malcolm X and Martin Luther King not been assassinated, that we would be living in a very different country and a very different world right now, because they were such powerful leaders. I mean, this was the whole thing about COINTELPRO, prevent the rise of a Black messiah, because they knew that a powerful leadership coming out of the Black community in a moment of great change and also a moment of great turmoil. I mean, obviously the economy was good in the 1960s, but you were having major technological changes, for instance, that were starting to question, the big industrial economy and the dislocation of what was going on, the first conversations about the environment and what the impact of pollution and other things were that were happening, and so on and so forth. We could go on this point, but you had people really starting to think that perhaps the setup of the capitalist system needed to change significantly. Now, for some, it might have been a more revolutionary vision. For others, it might have been something more like a democratic socialism, like Dr. King, who was, I think, looking towards, not exactly, but perhaps countries like Scandinavia, but nonetheless, things that would be drastically different than the just total rank profiteering, and of course, of the United States at that time and continuing today. And I think that assassination is key. And one thing I think that's also important to note here is, in 1967, when you had the 1967 war that took place in Palestine, now Dr. King's position there was it's not what my position would have been. But I do think it's important that we get the historical record straight here, because the Zionists have also been trying to use Martin Luther King's image to say, well, Martin Luther King was for Israel and would be 100% with us today. But it's important to note that in the 1967 war, Dr. King said the only way for there to be peace was for there to be a Palestinian state in Palestine and for Israel to completely remove itself from the occupied territories that they had occupied after 1948. So in fact, he had a position that is totally unacceptable to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis today. That would be totally unacceptable to the United States government today. And ultimately, that is a position that is not one that can be used to use his image to back this genocide in Gaza. I think that's an important element of this as well. But as we can see, I think the way the history is twisted is in every possible way to draw people away from making the obvious conclusions that individuals like Martin Luther King, who we revere, rightly so, were making deep structural critiques of society and very clearly said that nothing could actually be changed for the better unless we made deep structural changes. Martin Luther King would definitely be in that 70% of people in the United States and the 78% of Black Americans in the United States and the 73% of working class Americans in the United States that say the economy needs major change or to be completely torn down.
At that time, Eugene, and I think this is an important lesson, again, we're talking about the debates within the left about whether or not people have to go and support Biden because Trump means the end of democracy. There are a number of groups. I don't need to name them, but they exist in the left. They're socialist and revolutionary and even communist for 3.5 years every election cycle. And for the last 6 months, they're like, no, we must support the Democratic Party because the option is so terrible. And they've been doing this for a long time. But when you think about how change does come about, the war in Vietnam did not end during the Johnson administration. It ended during the Nixon administration. Roe v. Wade, the right of women to have the legal right to control their own bodies and have an abortion if they so choose, that was under Nixon, not under the Democrats. So just having a Democrat isn't the thing that solves the problem. In fact, it may be the opposite. But the other element of change that I think is so important if we're talking about this is not simply to use abstractions. J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI and COINTELPRO, which you mentioned, which stands for Counterintelligence Program, that the FBI waged against the left, and especially against the black freedom struggle. When you mentioned J. Edgar Hoover was determined to prevent the rise of a black messiah. That concept by J. Edgar Hoover, and you can see this in terms of how COINTELPRO worked, wasn't simply to prevent the leader of black America, a left progressive leader of black America. At the time that Dr. King was killed, millions of young white people were in the streets against the war in Vietnam, or supporting the civil rights movement, or supporting the women's rights movement, the women's liberation movement. And Dr. King, or Malcolm X, or other important leaders in the black movement who could have been the black messiah, according to J. Edgar Hoover's sort of thinking, they would have been the leaders not only of black America, but also all of progressive America fighting for change. And, you know, the anti-war movement in the beginning was kind of a young white person dominated movement, and the black civil rights movement, which was multiracial, but was primarily from the black community, those two movements could have united under leadership, with leadership. And I think that's why J. Edgar Hoover wanted to make sure that there was no black messiah, because the possibility of a broad class struggle against war and against sexism and for workers' rights and for gay rights, which was just an emerging movement at that time, that could crystallize as a multinational movement with black leadership. And I think the FBI, as a class-conscious ruling class institution, was supremely aware of that. And that's why the priority of assassinating black leaders was so primary.
No, I think that's an important point, and to note about some of the B-roll that was on the screen when you were talking at some of the Vietnam veterans against the war. I think some of that was from Winter Soldier, people throwing their medals back. I mean, the U.S. government was terrified of the leaders of the Vietnam veterans against the war because they thought the social weight of them being veterans would allow them to really lead. I mean, they were leading large numbers of people, but in a way that they would really have trouble discrediting it. You know, it's actually funny now, and you see how sort of maybe the agency of history, John Kerry, who obviously turned out to be a big dud, was actually one of the people they feared the most because he had kind of a blue blood background. And in the sort of conversations around the Nixon administration, they were saying that the rise of the black movement, the veterans movement, and having people who had, you know, sort of traditional sort of ruling class-ish type backgrounds who were also ensconced in some of these movements could actually start to throw up leaders that could really seriously challenge on multiple levels the leadership of the United States of America. And thus, this is a big part of, you know, the Nixon enemies list, which was another form of suppression in addition to COINTELPRO, because a lot of social forces were coming together. You had the black movement that was rising. You had veterans and the anti-war movement that were coming together that was, you know, even getting into sort of the middle class, more elite parts of the population and starting to radicalize them. You had is a very contradictory sort of issue that was happening, but one that's not really discussed whatsoever, but a rising tide of labor resistance that was happening at the same time. You had the wildcat strike of the postal workers in 1970. You had the rising up of the opposition movement in the mine workers in 1969 and 1970. You had multiple different things. I won't go on and on here, but you could see this sort of emergent, you know, reality that from even some of the halls of the elites like Columbia University down to the sort of lowest levels of the poorest workers, down to the most dejected people who had been marginalized because of the service and in Vietnam and the challenges they were facing as veterans coming back, you know, was all starting to congeal a little bit. And there was really a dangerous situation. It was a dangerous moment. I mean, this is exactly why There's the famous Lewis Powell memo. Lewis Powell, who, of course, would go on to be Supreme Court Justice. At that time, I believe he was still working at Hunt & Williams, which is the big tobacco law firm there in Richmond, Virginia, and writing to some other grandees in the establishment at the time. I mean, I think he called it a shotgun blast on the establishment of America. People can fact check me there, but it was something of that nature. But he was laying out the fact that society was fraying around the edges and that more revolutionary challenges were serious and were coming to the forefront. And this would continue well into the 1970s, by the way. So I think it speaks to a deeper point that you're making here, or I think that you're making, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, which is that we have agency as people, and we have a lot of agency when we unite as individuals. And, you look at the labor movement, where the sort of foundational strikes of 33, 34 that we talk a lot about that set the stage for the CIO actually preceded the legislation that made it legal to strike. The conversation around civil rights came after people started rising up for and in favor of civil rights. It's not that the politicians don't matter at all, but it's that the politicians are only able to operate within a framework that is shaped by the social forces of society. The 1% versus the 99%, to be sort of flip about it, right? The politics of the elites that are trying to shape society to their benefit, and the politics of the masses that are trying to shape society to their benefit. And that clash between those forces shapes the political terrain on which the politicians are able to operate. So you're not going to have these pro-capitalist politicians taking money from all these rich people, do things that are against the elite agenda, unless they feel that there's a pushback coming the other way, which I think speaks very heavily to the lesser of two evils, or maybe it doesn't, and I'm just segueing here, but I'd like to speak to it because the point you made about them having done this for a long time, to me, is so key. And this is the discrediting argument about lesser of two evils. I mean, I'm just going to pick a random year. Since 1980, every year the same people have said, lesser of two evils, vote for the Democrats, Republicans are terrible, and whatever. Now, Donald Trump might be the president again in 2024. So every election where we were supposed to have picked the lesser of two evils to arrest the right-wing slide in society, because that's what they say they're doing. They're not promising, a lot of these people on the left, they're not saying, oh, the Democrats are going to do everything we want you to do. They all have all the phrases and all the words about how the Democrats aren't this, the Democrats aren't that. Their argument is that this will help arrest the slide of the country further to the right, which ultimately means in a more pro-capitalist and, quite frankly, more pro-fascist direction. And all we have seen is the political agenda shift more to the right, to the point where when Barack Obama was elected, he himself was saying that I'm really more of a blue dog Democrat. I even have some sort of Reaganite type tendencies to me. So, I mean, this is where you are in 2008, where the Democratic champion is actually saying that he himself is very conservative. And I think anyone who ever watches politics, and certainly anyone who was alive at the time, and if you weren't alive, just go back to 1984. Look at the platform of Walter Mondale, who was like the centrist. He was definitely not some, radical left-wing politician. A lot of what he was saying to do in 1984, you'd be run off the stage in a Democratic primary saying that. Now, some of it sounds like Bernie Sanders. So it just gives you a sense that this is a completely and totally failed strategy. Despite saying hold your nose and vote for the Democrat, and it's going to stop things from getting worse, things continually move to the right. It was during the Clinton administration, for instance, that the immigration strategy that said we're going to try to drive people into the worst parts of the desert so they die. This is the deliberate strategy that was developed under Clinton. And I think for people to understand what's happening here and the way that Democrats operate is very key. Democrats speak to the problems of working class people for sure. Their role in the two-party system is to be more responsive, at least, maybe post-1964 and maybe starting with the 30s, but to be more responsive to the elements of the working class, especially who are, looking for someone to do something to stop the ravages of capitalism from just destroying their lives. They want more social programs. They want to support unions and so on and so forth. So a lot of times the Democrats speak to the problem, but they don't promote solutions that speak to the scale of the problem. And that opens up more space for the right and the far right to exploit those who are left behind because the status quo doesn't change. You look at Obama. Everyone wants universal health care. He doesn't do universal health care. He brings in the ACA. What's one of the big problems with the ACA? It creates this stratum of people who make too much money to get the subsidies, but not enough money to be able to afford health insurance. And that becomes a major driver of the Tea Party movement, which leads the country country further and further to the right. You can say the exact same thing about Trump. Trump's entire program is a reaction to the failures of both Democrats and Republicans, but the political system of the past 20 or 30 years. When he's talking about the impact of the hollowing out of the Rust Belt, big Clinton administration piece there, NAFTA, GATT, all the various things with the WTO. When you're talking about the impact of the wars, which Trump tries to benefit on, that's Democrats and Republicans, but Iraq, Afghanistan, even Yugoslavia, going back to what happened in the 1980s in Central America, this unending sense of constant wars happening, accelerated after 9/11. The impacts of racism that Trump is pushing forward that have been the results of some of these policies that have sent an inflow of people into this country just trying to find a way to survive and make it, but creating ethnic contradictions that have existed inside of society. So when you speak to a problem, but you don't actually solve the problem, you then have a lot of people who are real upset and salty because they thought, okay, well, I thought the problem was going to be solved and y'all didn't do it. And then the far right provocateurs and opportunists and others are able to come in and offer these false solutions, which mean the right wing only further grows. So the Democrats are not only not arresting the slide of the country to the right, they're facilitating the slide of the country to the right by not actually posing solutions that meet the scale of the problem. So on its own face, its own results, and the strategic reality of what we see happening, the lesser of two evils argument is completely and totally failed as a strategy to actually move society forward. And as we're discussing, really, it's only the mass movements of people acting together and using their agency that can shape the political environment that can force anyone to move or to back off of their position because we have made the situation ungovernable to some degree, which means there has to be some sort of compromise on the ground and there has to be a new political dispensation. And we have to have a political acumen to, I think, understand that and to be these facile arguments in the media and by some of these so-called leftists. It's just, some of them are just motivated because they're getting money from the Democrats. Some, I think, are just confused and need to wake up. But at the end of the day, we cannot go another cycle of an election with a failed strategy that has no real understanding of the underlying dynamics of capitalism and politics that mean the right wing is only further gaining from these lukewarm, milquetoast, totally inadequate Democrats that keep getting put in office.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And there's so much empirical evidence about this. I mean, when you think about in recent times, the summer uprising against racism after the killing of George Floyd was murdered May 25th, 2020. And within a few days, first the people in Minneapolis, and you were there with Breakthrough News filming it. That was a real uprising.
Yeah.
I mean, the community burned the police precinct down, and it spread all around the country. And then, if you remember, right at the end of May and on June 1st, Donald Trump convened a conference call with all of the governors and said, you have to crack down on these protesters because the protest movement against racism was spreading. And if you don't, we're going to invoke the Insurrection Act and we're going to send the U.S. military into the streets.
Yep.
And he walked across Lafayette Park and had that photo op taken with him holding a Bible, that ridiculous photo op. And the police cleared the park. They tear gas and pepper sprayed and hit people with stun grenades and all kinds of stuff so that Trump could walk across the park. Instead of that working, millions of people came into the streets. Millions. I mean, by mid-July, the estimates were 35 million people had come into some protest during that earlier 4 or 5 or 6 week period. Half of them had never been to a protest before. And then during that period when Trump was the president, this racist guy, Donald Trump, you had all sorts of reforms starting to be proposed. Confederate monuments and the names of schools, even if they're symbolic, they're not unimportant. When you keep invoking Confederate pro-slavery names for schools, for monuments, and all of the rest around the country, and that started to get taken down. Not because the Democrat was a president, because Trump was the president. It was because the masses of people were in the streets. Now when the people went out of the streets, under the Biden administration, some of those places, they're renaming the schools now with Confederate names. The point I'm making is it's not about who's president. It's about whether we have a movement in the streets. Whether we have a movement in the streets. And as you mentioned about the right of workers to have the right to strike, that didn't exist in the United States until the Wagner Act was passed, or the Wagner decision in 1935. But in 1934, there was a general strike in San Francisco, in Minneapolis, in Toledo, Ohio. The Communist Party and other socialist movements were organizing wildcat strikes. They were the force behind the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the mass unionization of industrial workers. That's when the CIO was becoming the leading civil rights movement in the South. So you had this mass uprising of working people led by the left, led by the Communist Party or other socialist parties, mainly the Communist Party, that, the government decided, and Roosevelt decided, well, yeah, unemployment insurance, that's a good idea. Social Security, that's a good idea. The right of workers to strike, that's a good idea. I mean, all of those good ideas came about because of mass struggle, not because people had decided to vote for the lesser evil.
No, I think that's a 100% important fact. And, the Democrats have failed to unshackle, the power of labor now. I mean, and it's a connection, I think, between the cultural element, which I agree with you 100%, and I want to get to vis-a-vis the historical memory issue. I haven't looked at the statistics lately, but, in 2018, the average worker's purchasing power was the same as it had been in 1964. So, I mean, it gives you a sense of how bad things are. But if you think about how the Democrats actually push forward, they're always telling the unions we're going to do for this, and these union leaders are always spending hundreds of millions of dollars on them. It's like Lucy with the football. Had they passed card check and the Employee Free Choice Act and removed some of the shackles that had put on unions by Taft-Hartley and other different laws over the years, you would have been able to start to claw back those gains, because the tens of millions of workers who are interested in joining a union, and unions are more popular than they've ever been, it would be a much easier path for them to be able to organize, to bargain on the job, to push back against their bosses, to wage their raises and increase their benefits. And so in addition to not only passing budgetary laws that could actually help working class people, the Democrats have refused to pass laws to help working class people help themselves. And they have maintained these criminal laws that make it more difficult for people to fight for their rights on the job. And Biden trying to present himself as the most pro-union president, but yet again, just like Obama, totally failed to actually pass, any significant. You had the Employee Free Choice Act under Obama. You had the PRO Act under Biden. Okay, maybe you couldn't do Build Back Better. You couldn't even give unions the ability to actually organize at a higher level, and you're allegedly the most pro-union president that's ever existed because you went to a couple picket lines. I mean, it's completely and totally absurd. But it speaks to the context of what took place in 2020, because this really is critically important. To have, Confederate monuments and schools and these things is to actually suggest that somehow these people were justified in what they did. I mean, they're certainly relevant and important historical figures in the history of the country, but in the negative sense, not the positive sense. What they did was 100% wrong. I mean, even Robert E. Lee was against putting up Robert E. Lee statues. So, I mean, it gives you a sense of the fact, and most of them, by the way, went up after 1900, and they were a reaction to the destruction of Reconstruction, and they were assigned to black people in America and others, but certainly black people, that there was a reimposition of white supremacy in a way that was akin to the antebellum times, but that ultimately we have to be able to push forward and to discuss that this was 100% wrong, 100% incorrect, it should not be celebrated, and that its legacy is a legacy that is 100% linked to the negative situation that exists for people today in terms of the pocketbook issues. Because the creation of the stratified hierarchy of working class people on the basis of race is one of the main issues that has made it difficult for workers to move forward. It's stopped them from unionizing. It's kept them divided. It's created differential structures that make more profit. And all workers, even the white workers who maybe get a little bit more than the black workers, end up losing out because they don't unite in a critical way to fight back in an important sense. And so when you look at what happened in 2020, the right wing was able to take advantage of this because the so-called Democratic progressives were unable to bring in any program that could actually assist in improving people's living standards. So for a lot of white people who felt their living standards were going down, that the sort of differential privilege that they had been granted in a post-World War II society, I mean before that, but we're talking about modern times here now, is going down, that the right wing could come in and say, Well, remember when things were good for you, for your grandparents? What was different? Well, black people had no rights. Women stayed in the home. Gay people, I mean, what is that? You know, they were so far deep in the closet, it's not even really an issue that's there. And they have this Occam's razor kind of thing that's like, well, look who seems to be doing well when you're going down. Now, that is also fake because the average black worker is also doing very badly. The average Latino worker also doing very badly. The trans population of trans workers are some of the highest unemployment, poverty rates, and so on and so forth. So they're telling lies about these communities that they want people to hate. But either way, you can see there's an Occam's razor element to it. But if you had a progressive politics that was like, yeah, we're going to take down these statues, we're going to promote affirmative action, we're going to address these remedies, but we're not just talking about addressing remedies in the abstract. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats. We're going to empower unions that people's wages go up. We're going to have a child tax credit so that your family isn't starving. We're going to make sure that there are significant laws in to protect your rights to overtime and all these other different pieces. And we're going to raise the floor. We're going to have a higher minimum wage. We're going to eliminate the tip minimum wage. We're going to raise the floor for all working class people. We're going to give them the tools to fight from that floor to get to an even higher level, sitting at the table and not just get some crumbs, but get a significant piece of the pie in addition to these other pieces. I think, quite frankly, the vast majority of people would be 100% for that. And one way to know that is that Biden won the election pretty handily, saying something similar to that. So ultimately, there is a lot of misconceptions that I think are put in place by the right wing about the so-called cultural politics of the country that only really work because the Democrats, again, a pro-capitalist party that is not invested in the agenda of working class people, is unable to situate the fight for racial and gender equality and a broader economic justice framework that shows how fighting against discrimination, fighting for the unity of the working class is also a critical element of fighting for improving people's living standards on a day-to-day basis. So it's another example of how the Democrats speaking to a problem, but failing to meet the scale of the problem, is actually creating wedges and spaces that the far-right, semi-fascist type forces in many cases are able to take advantage of and gain greater positions of power, and the country only moves further to the right. Without an alternative, the Democrats are no alternative, the right wing is in the driver's seat, and they're able to exploit the contradictions that are existing and only growing in our society because of the dynamics of capital.
I really want to emphasize the point that you're making, Eugene, for our audience, especially for people who are in the left. The Democratic Party isn't an alternative to the right. The Democratic Party is a facilitator of the right. And in all ways, I mean, it's a very complicated sort of thing. When we look at elite politics, we don't want to simply have this kind of, there's not a dime's worth of difference between Trump and Biden. No, there's a difference. There are differences, but we want to get to the core, the essence. We want to look at what's actually important as opposed to what's superficial or secondary. What's primary? When you think about what Ronald Reagan tried to do during those 8 years, and liberal people, progressive people were very depressed that somebody like Reagan could get elected. And he always talked, as he was campaigning, against welfare queens and all of this language, which was thinly veiled racist code about the welfare system, about black people, et cetera, even though the majority of people on welfare, on public assistance, were white people. That was the Ronald Reagan's program. But Reagan could not actually get rid of the welfare system in America, the system of public assistance. That was Bill Clinton. In 1996, when it was clear that he was going to be reelected because the Republicans were weak, Dole was weak, the Democrats were riding high because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were kind of taking credit for it. Clinton had come, there was a recession when Clinton was elected. So Bill Clinton says, we're going to end welfare as we know it. And overnight, they kicked 10 million poor people off of welfare benefits. Overnight. 7 million of those people were children. So when you talk about how childhood poverty exponentially increased, that was Clinton. The Criminal Justice Reform Act, or whatever it was called, and you will know the name, that was during Clinton. That was shepherded by Joe Biden. That was 1994. It took America 200 years to reach the 1 million mark in terms of the number of people incarcerated in U.S. prisons. That was like by 1976. But within the next 20 years, that number doubled. Then it went to 2 million, went from 1 million to 2 million, such that 1 out of every 4 prisoners in the world was in a U.S. jail. That was the Democrats. They were adopting the program of the right, and all of the liberals who were supporting the Democrats said, oh, how clever the Democrats are by adopting the language of the Republicans. Now we have Bill Clinton instead of another Republican. But what was the effect? It was the same thing. If you adopt the Republican racist anti-working class program, it's not clever. It's just a racist anti-working class program that now becomes normalized. And then it was Clinton who said, we're going to overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime. It wasn't about weapons control. It was under Clinton that the war in Yugoslavia was waged in 1999. The last socialist government in Europe was destroyed with 28,000 bombs and missiles. I mean, when you look at this history and to have people on the left say, oh, but we got to watch out for Donald Trump because he's going to end democracy, I would say they're mainly worried about themselves. They think maybe under Trump, there will be like a regression on civil liberties for leftists in America. Because when you look at Yugoslavia or Palestine or the conditions of oppressed communities in the United States and internationally, you can say with complete certainty that there's nothing more humane about the Democratic Party than the Republican Party.
No, I think that's 100% true. I mean, the Clinton piece, I think you're right. I mean, it speaks to exactly what I'm saying. Like Reagan and Bush set the stage for the things move further to the right. Even though, they said vote for Carter, vote for Mondale, vote for Dukakis. You end up with Clinton when you finally get a Democrat in there, and he's accepted a huge amount of the right-wing shift. Bush obviously comes after Clinton. He's a hardcore right-winger, but again, he's able to drive things in further to the right. Then you have the ability of Obama to come in, but again, accepting many of the right-wing strictures on society, failing to go for universal health care. I mean, failing to make any sort of significant inroads in terms of tackling the big banks and using it as an opportunity to end the Wall Street casino gambling to some degree. That just, goes by the wayside. Then, of course, we move on and on. People can see exactly what's happening. You have Trump. But the things, despite the lesser of two evils, more and more of the right-wing assumptions of how society should be governed. And when we say right-wing, we should be realistic about this. That's the core agenda of the capitalist class, which is to maximize profit at the expense of the working class people. More and more of the logic. Some people call it neoliberalism, and let's just use that term for shorthand's sake. That more and more of the logic of neoliberalism becomes baked into the politics of the country, to where you're in a space where something like Build Back Better could be blocked by the Democrats, even though it wasn't even changing anything significantly. It was just giving more money to existing programs that are extraordinarily popular amongst people of all political persuasions. So it gives you a sense of how far right things are moving and how disgusting it is at times to even see it. I mean, the Clinton, this is kind of an aside, but for people who don't know, let's remember that Clinton, when he was campaigning in 1992, actually took time off the campaign trail. He was the governor of Arkansas, to fly back to Arkansas to execute Ricky Ray Rector, who was a black man who was on death row. And it was a complicated case because Ricky Ray Rector had killed a police officer, but then he tried to kill himself. But he didn't die. He lobotomized himself. So he had no idea who he was. They used to call him sometimes the Chicken Man because he would make animal noises. And in fact, even when he was on his way to be taken to be executed, he left a piece of pie from his last meal aside. And the pastor who was there said, why aren't you eating your pie? And he said, I'm saving it for later. He didn't even know what it meant to be executed. But Clinton did it on purpose to show how tough he was, that he was willing to go and execute a mentally disabled person who had no idea what it even mean to die or where he was or what was going on, to prove what was going on. I already mentioned the issue of immigration and Clinton saying that his administration, they're going to drive people into the desert so that they would die, to deliberately increase the mortality rate. I mean, some of these things are so disgusting that I feel we've almost lost it historically. I mean, obviously Biden with the issue of the crime bill, Hillary Clinton with the super predators thing. I mean, all of the just insane politics that were driven at that moment that increased the number of people in incarceration, that destroyed entire communities, that ripped families apart, and that almost all criminologists who agree on almost nothing else agree had zero impact in why violent crime ultimately in the second half of the 90s and really actually until today has been on a downward, significant downward slide. Mass incarceration did not help that. But again, you're right. It's under the watch of the Democrats because, again, though, and I'm glad you brought up the point about the differences. The real problem with the Democrats and the Republicans is that there is a difference, is that Democrats are actually trying to say, we're going to do these good things. But then when they do not do them or only do them partially, it only helps the right wing grow. So in a way, the very fact that the Democrats are trying to exploit the difference between their policies, more progressive policies, more pro-working class policies, and the right wing is exactly what's creating the dynamic where their inability to deliver is helping the right wing grow. So again and again and again, what we see is not that there's no difference between the two political parties, but the inability of the Democrats to have solutions that meet the scale of the problem means that their false promises compound on themselves over and over again, which allows a far-right, semi-fascist, openly fascist critique to grow inside of the country because it appears to be the only thing that's really openly breaking with the status quo. And that's why, despite the fact that it's much maligned, left-wing, progressive, socialist, anti-imperialist, whatever you want to call them, third-party efforts are critically important because they're creating a narrative in society that, like the right wing and the far right, is validating people's anger and upsetness and distrust and disgust at the system, but is saying that the real solutions aren't in tearing each other apart, turning inward against each other, cutting taxes for the ultra-wealthy, but it's about building unity, coming together as working class people, and making the billionaires and the 100 millionaires and the super rich people pay for the damage that they've done to our communities, the damage that they're doing to our class, the destruction that they're wreaking on all of this in a more progressive way. But if you don't have that side of it, things only move further to the right. And that's why ultimately, and it speaks to the issue of people being in the streets, the sort of corollary of that is there often tend to be more viable non-major party options that come up in elections from individuals who are just so disgusted with the system, and it helps create in the sort of binary between the street and the ballot box, and the progressive media that's out there to the extent that it exists, to create this separate pole that allows people to be validated in their anger, but to see that the real solutions are not to go further and further to these politics of hatred and division that are being pushed like people like Donald Trump. So it's not that there's no difference. It's how do we actually resolve the problems that are facing us? And that is the only thing that can actually eliminate the far right challenge. That's why the Nazis had to get rid of the left, because they had to make sure that there was no one who could offer up a solution to the problems of the collapse of Weimar Germany and the Great Depression that was not a fascist. And so in a similar situation here now, where if we just abdicate for ourselves, if we just abdicate responsibility and say left-wing people, progressive people just have to back the Democrats, we're actually creating a framework in which the far right and the fascist forces will grow, because people who are angry won't see any other alternative, and people who don't like the far right will be totally disarmed and totally demobilized between a false leadership that they won't be able to fight back. So we have to have the movements in the street. They have to be rooted in organizations where we pool our individual agency into collective agency, and it has to be directed against both major parties to show people that there's a different vision and a different way that we can live in this country and live in the world.
Couldn't agree with you more. Stay in the street, build independent political movements, look for third parties, especially socialist parties. I was looking at the literature of Vote Socialist 2024, Claudia de la Cruz, Karina Garcia. There's also Jill Stein in the Green Party. Cornel West is running. But there has to be this multifaceted movement building. It can't be activism alone, and it certainly can't be simply in the electoral arena. I mean, when you look at everything we've talked about, Eugene, obviously, as we say in our show, we need a new system. The question is, how do you get to the new system? It's not impossible. In fact, it's inevitable that there will be a new system. but we have to make it happen. And it's only us. It's only the people. It's only the grassroots movement, the left movement, the real socialist movement that can make it happen. It won't be through the Democratic Party. As you have pointed out so well, supporting the Democratic Party is a graveyard for the left and a facilitator of the rise of the right. We can't let that happen. Eugene Puryear, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.